So, welcome to our next lecture. We are about to begin the Mor Nevuchim chapter 71 in part 1 of Mor Nevuchim. I think this is lecture number 50 in total. So, the to be completely honest, I guess, which we always are, the um the next few chapters are going to be rough. It can be rough to get through because there's a lot of philosophy. But I made the decision, and if people disagree with it, that then please let me know. I made the decision to just go straight through the Sefer, beginning to end. So there are juicy parts that we're going to get to all over the place in part 2 and part 3. We had a lot of juicy parts in part 1. Some of these are challenging to get through, but you'll still find pearls. We'll still find a lot of pearls within this. And in order to fully comprehend and to fully appreciate the power of the Rambam's brain through this work and to fully appreciate how he approaches things, I think it's important that we do everything. So we're on page 175 in the Pines English translation. This particular chapter, to be honest, I used the Hebrew kapach much more because it just read better, but I'll go through it the English. And there are some paragraphs that I might summarize because they get a little wordy, but let's work our way through. So the question that Rambam is about to deal with, and actually in a way of a little bit introduction to this chapter, we have to think a little bit about the intellectual world of Judaism that the Rambam was living in and the surrounding intellectual world where he was living in. And in his time, obviously, the two primary philosophical schools in the world in Rambam's time was the world of Christianity and the world of Islam. And Rambam himself spent most of his life in the world of Islam. Those two worlds were influenced by another world that preceded it, which was the world of Greek philosophy, and then which was eventually through the Roman days, it still remained the Greek schools of philosophy. Now, the most notable difference between those is the Greek schools of philosophy obviously were not monotheistic specifically, although Aristotle was, and then there's these two schools of monotheistic thought, Christianity and Islam. And the Rambam was dealing with the world in which the Jewish philosophical literature was very sparse indeed. Now, of course, there are some major Jewish philosophers that had written that stand out. Rab Sadia Gaon, of course, is one that comes to mind. Rab Shlomo ibn Gabirol or Bachya ibn Pakuda. There are some that preceded the Rambam whose literature he was familiar with and read and knew of, but it was very sparse. So within the Jewish world of writers, there wasn't much. There was, of course, all of the writings of the Tanakh and all and all the writings of Chazal, but in terms of people that wrote regarding the primary philosophical issues of the day, there wasn't that much. So Rambam's one of his most important contributions in this world, which was dominated by Islamic thinkers and Christian thinkers, was to put forward a Jewish approach that also addressed the primary philosophical issues of the day, which, as we know from the Rambam so far, was establishing the fact that the unity of God, for one, the fact that God was a incorporeal being and was a being beyond what any human being can possibly comprehend. Now, these are essential to understanding the world in a scientific way, like even what we would call today scientific. Because if one thinks of God as a magical being, and one thinks of a monotheism where there's lots of different spiritual powers running all different kinds of things on this world, then one cannot scientifically analyze the facts that one is looking at in this world. If one explains everything by understanding different spiritual forces of this God doing this God doing that, so that's why the unity of God is so important. If one thinks that God is someone that we can influence, that we can change, that he has a body, so then then the whole the whole religion falls apart. God becomes nothing but a grand human being who just happens to be more powerful than the rest of us, and so on. And the Rambam said all of this until now. So we have to understand in the context what Rambam was offering to the world when he said it's something different than what the Islamic and Christian philosophers of the time were saying, something that was uniquely Jewish, but also incorporated what was considered to be the knowledge of reality, the knowledge of what was then called science and physics and metaphysics, which is basically Aristotle. Okay, so now, with that introduction, let's look at the beginning of chapter 71. And again, another small introduction. The Rambam at the beginning of this chapter is dealing with the following question: why does it seem that what I'm saying is so new, right? For those of you, Rambam is saying, talking to people who have been coming to shul, going to the Beis Medrash, opening up a Chumash, opening up a Gemara, and learning and studying and reading, right? You've learned all of these stories of the Exodus from Egypt, of all of the commandments in the Torah. You learn all the stories of the prophets. You learn everything in the Gemara. You learn halacha. You learn everything. But nobody's gotten up and really written in a big way what I'm trying to teach you, which is all these philosophical concepts. Why? So are they really true? Like, why have they disappeared? And why is it that I'm just like just a unique voice in the wilderness, just popping this up all of a sudden, these new ideas, these modern ideas, is it? So Rambam is addressing that question right away. Know that the many sciences devoted to establishing the truth regarding these matters. And when he refers to these matters, he's referring to those three ideas: the oneness of God, the unity, God's unity, the fact that he is incorporeal, doesn't have a body, and the fact that he's beyond human comprehension. So why is it? But I want you to know that they have existed in our religious community, but they have perished, right? I'm sorry. The many sciences devoted to establishing the truth regarding these matters that have existed, right? They've perished. In other words, they're not something that people commonly know about or talk about because of the length of time that has passed. Because we've been in exile for a long time, Rambam is saying, because of being dominated by the pagan nations, because we didn't have the opportunity to have our own schools, we've been dominated, and because, as we have made clear, it is not permitted to divulge these matters to all people, because Rambam is saying that the esoteric nature of the Torah is such that it is written in such a way that the common folk, the simple folk, will look at it and read it on a simplistic level. But these ideas that are much loftier and harder for the common folk to understand are hidden. They only are taught to people that have the capability of understanding it. So therefore, for the only thing permitted to divulge to all people are the texts of the books. They can read the Torah, they can read the text, even though that text could be misleading at times. You already know that even the legalistic science of law, even halacha, and I'm going to skip a couple of things, right, are governed by the well-known dictum, right, which are, words that I have communicated early. This is the famous Talmud that says that the oral tradition is meant to be oral, right? The written tradition, what's written in the Tanakh, what's written in the Torah and the prophets, were meant to stay, was written, and the stuff that was meant to. So this precept shows extreme wisdom with regard to the law. This makes sense. Rambam says it makes sense that the oral tradition was meant to be oral. And why is that? Because if the oral tradition, which includes a multiplicity of opinions, a variety of schools, confusions occurring in the expression of what is put down in writing, in other words, arguments over the meanings of different verses, anyone that's studying Daf Yomi, anyone that opened a Talmud looks and sees a verse and sees 6 different ways to understand the verse, 12 different arguments back and forth as to who's right and who's wrong, 9 different people deciding about how to make decisions. If all of that tradition was something that was in writing, which it is now, but it wasn't meant to be originally, right? In the end, the divisions of the people who are separated into different sects and production of confusion with regard to actions. People will know, which way do I do things? How do I act? What's the right law? What's the right way to interpret this verse, and so on. All these matters should be within the authority of the great court of law. The common folk should be told, this is what you got to do. Finish. It's much simpler, much easier, right? As we have made clear in the Mishnah Torah, Rambam says. Now, if there was insistence that the legalistic science of the law should not, so if this was true about the law, about halacha, right, which, as we know, encompassed in today's Mishnah and Talmud, is full of so many different things that a common person could get very confused. So initially, the intent was that it shouldn't be publicized, it should remain a tradition. Then imagine how the same thing would be, and I'm paraphrasing this myself, skipping some of his sentences, right? Imagine how important that would be for these ideas that I'm trying to teach you, right? The idea is that when the Torah says that God reached out his hand, that doesn't mean that he had a hand. When the Torah talks about God in ways that make him sound like he has a body, that make him sound like he gets angry, that make him sound like he has human emotions, right? People would get very confused about them. So therefore, the Torah left it in its simple way. On the contrary, they were transmitted by a few men belonging to the elite, right? As we said, the mysteries of the Torah, and we talked about that earlier, may only be transmitted to a counselor, wise and crafts, people that are educated and can understand what we're talking about. This is the cause. That is why the disappearance of these great roots of knowledge happened from the nation. For you will not find with regard to them anything except slight indications and pointers occurring in Talmud and Medrash. So as you learn through the Talmud, as Rambam quoted before, every time he made a point, he backed it up with a quote. But you're able to see that it's a quote here, a couple chapters later, a quote there, a phrase here. So it's there, Rambam saying, but you got to look for it and find it because of what he just said. So that, as it were, a few grains belonging to the core, which are overlaid by many layers of rind. So people are occupied with all the layers of rind and thought that beneath them there is no core. Okay, so now, if that's true, okay, so now, and what about this, the little bit that we do find, right? Because we do find some writers that write about the unity of God, and most of the commentaries and the people describe Rambam in this paragraph is referring to Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon, right? So you'll find in the writings of some Gaonim and the writings of the Karaites, and now here it's interesting. The thing that I got most from this was the incredible amount of reading and research that Rambam did to develop these ideas, like the power of his mind. He had studied the works of the Karaite writers, right? He studied all of the works of the Jewish writers, the Gaonim, what he's referring to. And he referred in depth, he's going to describe in depth the different schools of thought within Islam and his extent of reading throughout them. He describes that the writings that he had studied deeply from the Christian writers of his day, and how he had studied through the Greek philosophers in depth. And he was really trying to pull all of this together. And that's really the power that comes forth out of this, that a person with such an incredible thirst of knowledge is teaching us that that's the right way to approach the truth, is to try to find all the different perspectives that you can get your hands on and try to synthesize something that makes sense. I'm going to skip the next this paragraph at the bottom of 176 and 177. I'll just say really quick. He says that he shows how the ideas discussed by the early Jewish philosophers came straight out of some of the early Islamic philosophers. And then he describes different just mentions a few different groups of Islamic philosophers. And then I'm going to go to the second paragraph on page 177. As for the Andalusians, meaning in the Hebrew one is translated as the Sfardim, and the Kapach says he's referring to Rabbeinu Shlomo ibn Gabirol, a famous early Jewish philosopher from Spain, who wrote actually many of the piyutim that made their way into the into our liturgy, and also Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Pekuda, the author of the Chovos HaLevavos, and others that the Rambam is clearly referring to in this paragraph here, that possibly the Ibn Ezra, who it's debatable whether the Rambam was familiar with Ibn Ezra's works or not, but he was a member of that same school, so to speak. So all of them cling to the affirmations of the philosophers. In other words, they didn't gather their information from the Muslims, but they are sticking with the Greek philosophers. You will not find them taking the paths of the Mutakalamun, which is the early Muslim school of philosophers. And many things concerning the scanty matter of which the latter ones among them had knowledge, they have therefore approximately the same doctrine that we set forth in this treatise. In other words, I'm siding with them because they stuck with philosophers. So the Rambam is saying, I'm sticking with what the almost the equivalent of what I'm sticking with the scientists, okay? But obviously, it's not scientists in the sense that we say today. He's referring to the Greek philosophers. Now, um, the uh, uh, the next paragraph, 177. I'm also going to paraphrase. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but what he's going to say, what he says in this paragraph here, is he says all of these statements of the early thinkers in Islam and all of the early thinkers of the Christians, they had certain beliefs which they wanted to prove, right? And here's where the Rambam gets a little, not a little, but a lot gutsy here, pointing his fingers at the opposing great religions of his time. They had beliefs that they wanted to prove, right? But they wanted to back up their beliefs with what was known to be the science of the day, which is Aristotelean philosophy, Greek philosophy. So what he's saying is they started, I'm skipping a little down, they started to establish premises that would be useful to them with regard to their belief and to refute those opinions that ruin the foundations of their law. So they searched the Greek philosophy to find things that would back up those beliefs that they had. And they also searched for things that would refute them and that would contradict the beliefs that they wanted to support, and threw those out in the garbage can, right? And try to refute those. In other words, they picked and chose from their predecessors the things that supported them, and then they refuted those things that did not support them. When they're so he says so, and then he goes on. I'm turning to page 178 now. But by saying that, what happens here is, and then he says, and that created a mess, because once you have all of these philosophers saying, oh, let's look at all the Greek philosophers, and you see that they support me because this point supports this point, and this point supports this point, and he explicitly refers to the Trinity, which in his mind is like is something that he completely can't tolerate. The Christian idea of the Trinity bothers the Rambam a lot. This is, I think, the third time he mentioned that as something that they're trying to pick things out of the Greek philosophers to support them on other things that they can't. And then the Rambam says, well, so what happened was later people that trying to be honest. In other words, I'm trying to say, I'm not a Muslim, I'm not a Christian, and I want to read read these books. They didn't realize what was happening, and they didn't realize that all of these analyses of philosophy were done with the idea that they were trying to reach a certain conclusion, a preconceived conclusion. So now they look and they say, oh, those Greek philosophers were really off base, because half the things they said are good, half the things they said are no good. So then they throw out all the philosophers. So it creates this entire situation where if somebody tries to read something, and you're getting the sense that the Rambam is almost bringing us through his own life's moving, his own life study throughout these works, that it got to the point when he's reading the Christian philosophers that they're making the Greek philosophers make no sense. And the Muslim philosophers also make the Greek philosophers make no sense. But let's go back to the Greek philosophers and see what they actually said, which is what he's about to do. So then at the bottom of 178, he says, to sum up, okay? And I'm gonna suggest that you read that. But basically, he says over here in that paragraph that that when you're trying to find out the truth, and this is really nice, and this is something we can all go home with. I know we're going into all this philosophy stuff, but I told you there's going to be pearls. Well, here's a pearl. You can't start with a premise that you want to prove and then figure out a philosophy that backs up that premise, right? The Rambam says this in strong terms, right? You can't go ahead and decide, right? This is what my belief is. I believe it, right? And now I'm going to go ahead and try to figure out how the philosophy or how the science backs up my belief. Because reality is reality. Facts are facts. You have to start with the facts, and then you figure out how to explain those facts in as honest a way as possible, right? And in the end, if you look on 179, after he describes that, he says, to sum up, I shall say to you the matter is as Themistius puts it. That was a Greek philosopher in like the 3rd century. According to the Christian counting, the 3rd century, CE, Common Era. So that which exists does not conform to the various opinions, but rather the correct opinions conform to that which exists, right? In other words, you can't say that this is reality. Reality is in front of me, and it conforms to all the different, and then you have to figure out the opinions to back up the no. What you have to do is you see what exists, and then you have to find the explanations that actually explain what actually exists. And this is a very, very important idea of the Rambam, which comes up in many places. It's also paraphrased in one of his most famous quotes. If you look up Maimonides' quotes on the internet, it's the idea that he expressed in his introduction to Pirkei Avot, where Rambam says that we have to seek the truth from wherever it comes. In other words, you need to bend to reality. You can't decide before you do research what you're going to find. If you do that, then you're missing the boat. You have to look at reality and then figure out how best to understand it. So now I'm in the end of page 1, and that's something we can all go home with. Reality is what's important, not supporting what it is that you decided you believed before you went. But if you go to the book and start reading it when you already know what your conclusion is, you're already off base. And this is so relevant, you don't need me to explain to you why this is relevant. So then Rambam goes on at the bottom of page 179, and he goes a little into the following issue. So that one of the main philosophical issues, and here Rambam leaves the Christian philosophers out, and he starts going to the philosophers that he's going to be debating back and forth much more, and those are the Mutakalimun, which is the early philosophers of Kalam, early Islamic philosophers, and how they differed from the Greek philosophers. And now I'm going to describe a few things, and I'm not trained in philosophy myself. I get this just from my reading, so I hope I do this right. But basically, the following issue is one of the major debates of the time, and that is we could say it is the Olam Kadmon or is the Olam Mechudash. What that means is, has the existence of the world always been, right? In other words, has it always been this way, the eternity of the world before us? Or is there a time when the world didn't exist and then it came into being? Okay, that's the debate. The Greek philosophers, Aristotle famously believed in the eternity of the world. The world always existed. Okay, and the Islamic philosophers, right, believed that the world came to be. Right now, Rambam, and I'm without reading this because it's very it's wordy, it's hard, but you're welcome to read it yourself. I'm paraphrasing it now, so you'll have to trust me on this, right? That the Mutakalimun, the Islamic philosophers, started with the conclusion, with the idea, right, that it has to be, right, that God, that the world started at a certain time, right? Because that's their belief, right? That's what it says in, I haven't read the Quran, but I know that that's what is there, and that's what's in the Bible, and so on. That the world was created at a point in time. Now, they taking that as, and they went ahead and tried to prove that scientifically. So once you start off with the idea that the world had to start at a certain, that the world, there's a time when it didn't exist and it came into being, then there must have been someone that made it happen. Because if there's something that isn't there, and then all of a sudden it is there, right? Then who decided to make it be there? Right? Something, some entity must have decided, I'm going to make this happen, right? And they use that as a proof of God. Okay. The Greek philosophers, on the other hand, they felt that the world, this is the way the world always was, right? Now remember, the Greeks proved that based on the reality that they saw in front of them, right? So a scientist, so to speak, in those days, see, now it's different because now science knows that there was a beginning of time, a Big Bang. But in those days, a scientist like an Aristotelean would look at the world and say, every single thing we see, matter doesn't change its form, right? I mean, matter doesn't cease to exist. It just changes form, right? Energy doesn't cease to exist. It just changes form, right? So everything that's here on this world, right? It came about because of something that was before it, because something before it, and things go round and round and round and round. And as long as we could look back in the past, and as long as we can predict forward into the future, things are going to continue going on the way they are. So therefore, it must be that it was always like this. There was never a beginning. It was always like this. So, and Rambam points out in the chapters that I'm skipping, I'm turning to page 180 now, right? That no one will ever prove no one will ever prove this argument, right? Whether or not the world has always been, or whether or not the world has a point in creation. So Rambam wants to say that regardless of which one of those paths you take, it has to be that, in other words, I don't need to use the Mutakalamun, the Islamic philosopher's approach of saying the world was created at a point in time in order to prove the existence of God. Rambam says, I can prove and I will prove the existence of God, even if, or actually, especially if I take the Aristotelean path and assume that the world always existed. And then the Rambam adds, don't think, right? So if we look for a minute, and here I'm right now at the paragraph at the bottom of page 180 and the top of page 181. Don't think that I'm therefore advocating that the world always existed. No, I believe that the world had a point in time where it was created. But I'm telling you that to prove the existence of God, and meaning the unity of God, the fact that God doesn't have the incorporeality of God, and the fact that a human being cannot comprehend this God, right? I will prove that even if we stick with the scientific approach. Okay. So and then he says in the middle of page 181, if you are one of those who are persuaded by what the Mutakalmun say, right, and you believe that the demonstration with regard to the creation of the world and time is correct, bravo for you, right? If you're going to take their approach and you're going to say that, yeah, the world was created at a certain point of time and that proves the existence of God, right, then that's fine, right? But Rambam says, but it's not provable. And right now he's summarizing what he's going to say in more detail later, why it is that the Mutakalmun's proof doesn't work. It reminds me a lot of when nowadays we read books, and here I'm it's a little bit of a stretch, but I think this is legit what I'm about to say. When often you'll read a book today that proves the existence of God on basis of some idea, and lots of these things could sometimes be interesting. However, there's an inherent problem in 99.9, maybe even 100% of them, right? And that is that it makes sense and it makes sense and it makes sense, but then when you really think about it, especially sometimes you can read an atheist's rebuttal of the book, and obviously, wait a minute, that whole thing just fell apart. So the Rambam is saying the Mutakalmun's approach, while it makes sense on the surface, I'm telling you, the Rambam says that you can't prove it. It won't work. And he's going to show us why that is in the upcoming chapters. So if we're going to take their approach and say, that's why I believe in God because of that line of logic, well, that's a problem. Because if that's the only reason why I believe in God, well, I'm telling you that it doesn't work. So that's why he says, if, however, it is not demonstrated in your opinion, and if you take over from the prophets through obeying their authority, the doctrine that was created in time, there is no harm in that. So he says, so in other words, that's another approach you can take. You can also say, well, I don't understand this philosophical stuff. I believe it because the prophet said so. That's fine too, right? However, you ought to know that the premises that are established by those concerned with the roots, I mean, among them, right? With the view to affirming the creation of the world imply, right, an upsetting of the world. I'm telling you that it doesn't work. Their proof doesn't work, because if you're going to try their proofs, it's going to mess up. It doesn't explain reality as is. So now the Rambam then says on the bottom of 181, as to this my method, it is I shall describe to you in a general way now. What do I want to explain? How do I want to explain the existence of the world? And I know, and I'm aware that a lot of this is flying over our heads because we don't live in this world where people are arguing about these philosophical concepts. Our arguments when we discuss issues of science versus religion, so to speak, are very different than those. But we can still learn a lot from the Rambam's approach. And that's why I brought that example, that if you're going to try to say, I'm going to prove God with this thing of logic, and you write that in a book, someone can come along and disprove it, and the whole thing's going to fall apart, right? So what's my method? I shall say the world cannot be but either eternal or created in time. It has to be one or the other. One of these two schools must be right. If it is created in time, then it must be a creator. For it is the first, because of the way we explained it. I'm skipping a little bit. If, however, the world is eternal, it follows necessarily because of this and that proof. But I'm going to tell you, Rambam says that even if you take the Greek philosophy, so what the Rambam is setting up is like this: no matter which logical approach to the world is available by the philosophers today, I will still prove to you that God is one and God is the creator and so on. So no matter which logic, no matter one of these has to be true. And regardless of which one you take, I'm still going to prove to you this idea. That's the power of what Rambam is saying, right? If you take either or, you might knock it down, but I'm going to show it to you no matter what. So even if you take the Greek approach, you still, there has to be, and that proves that there is an existence other than all bodies to be found, an existence who is not a body and not a force in a body, who is one, permanent, and so on. Accordingly, he is a deity. Therefore, that's God. Thus, it has become manifest to you that the proofs for the existence and the oneness of the deity, right, ought to be procured from the starting point afforded by the supposition of the eternity of the world. So therefore, I'd rather take the scientific approach. And I know I use the term scientific, and I'm referring to the Greek philosophical approach. For this reason, you will always find, Rambam says, that whenever in what I have written in the books of jurisprudence, meaning in his Mishnah Torah, I happen to mention the foundations and start upon establishing the existence of the deity, I establish it by discourses. If you look carefully in my words, you'll see that I'm using the same terminology that the Greeks use. The reason is not that I believe in the eternity of the world. I'm using the Greeks' logic not because I believe that they're right about that aspect, but that I wish to establish in our belief the existence of God. I want to prove it to you through a demonstrative method through which there is no disagreement in any respect. In other words, I want to prove it to you with logic that works. I want to prove it to you with the scientific approach that makes sense. Okay. Thus, we shall not cause the true opinion, because I'm afraid that if I tried to use some tricks, something that's not true, that's not correct, it will fall apart. And then he says again in the second paragraph on page 182, the proofs that the Mutakalaman use are derived from premises that run counter to the nature of existence that is perceived. So if I'm trying to prove to you God by using non-scientifically correct facts, when you try to prove to somebody that evolution doesn't happen and you throw at him bogus bunk science, right? And then one day he wakes up and he realizes that that science that supposedly proved that evolution didn't happen was bogus and bunk, right? Then he's going to think, well, then God must not exist. So the Rambam is saying, no, you have to say what you're saying based on truth, based on something real, based on something that actually works, something that actually makes sense. And then he says, in the last paragraph on 182 that continues on the top of 183, he says, don't expect from me that when I'm telling you that this philosophical truth is truth and that it's logically backed up, I'm not necessarily going to go through all of that. In other words, go pick up Aristotle and read it. I'm not rewriting the whole book of all of Aristotle's literature and all the literature that followed him, right? But I'm going to tell it when I tell you that these things are scientifically proven, you have to trust me that I know my way through the literature, and what I'm telling you is correct, right? And the same thing, if I'm going to tell you how the Mutakalaman come about their proofs, you have to trust me that I'm laying it out. I'm not going to show you every single thing that they say. So now, and then he says, and he ends this paragraph, and ends this chapter 180 on 183 at the bottom. I have already let you know that there exists nothing except God may be exalted in this existent world, and that and that there is no possible inference proving his existence may be exalted except those deriving from this existence taken as a whole and from its details. In other words, you have to look at the facts. You have to look at the world as it is and the details of the world as it is in order to know and prove that God exists. Again, Rambam is emphasizing that 1,000 times, right? The only way you're going to prove his existence is if you actually look at the real world that's in front of you, not making up baloney, right? Accordingly, it necessarily behooves one to consider this existence as it is. And if you need to look at the world, at the planet, and derive premises from what is perceived of its nature, when you perceive the nature of the world that is in front of us, that is how you will find God. And this is the defining characteristic of the Rambam. The way to find God is by looking at the truth, at the actual, real, measurable truth. For this reason, it follows that you should know its perceptible form and nature. That's why you need to know the form and the nature of the world that is around us. For this reason, and then it will be possible to make an inference from it with regard to what is other than it. When you really know and understand the world, and this is, the Rambam said this numerous times in numerous ways, but he's emphasizing it again, then you can see what it means that there's something beyond that world, something that's not part of that world, something that's above, and something in it that's in a completely different type of existence altogether. For this reason, I judge that in the first place, it behooves me to set down a chapter in which I would explain to you that which exists as a whole by informing of that which is demonstrated and indubitably correct. That's why this is how I'm going to go through it. I'm first going to tell you, right, what exists, right, the world that exists in front of us. And then I'm going to tell you what we can definitely conclude is true about this world. After that, I will set down for your benefit other chapters where I'm going to go through the Mutakalaman and how they prove the existence of God. And after that, I will show you more chapters that show you how the philosophers then prove the existence of God. And that's the Aristotelean. So the Rambam is setting up something, and you can see how this is going to be. We're going to be delving into a lot of depths of medieval philosophy, but it's really important. It's hard to say like what's the most important thing that I gained from this chapter. I think the key things are the things that I was emphasizing when I was speaking, and that is number one, the depth of the Rambam's reading and knowledge is staggering. It's mind-blowing. I mean, it's like it literally had his handle on every bit of knowledge that was available to someone in those times. And number two, and his desire, his intense desire to find actual truth, regardless what those conclusions are. Al Rambam said over and over and over again how important it is not to start with the conclusion, but to look at the facts, and those facts are the nature that's sitting in front of you, the real, actual nature that's sitting in front of you, and use that in order to figure out how it all came to be. And that then Rambam then concluded that God is one, which is a powerful idea, and that's the main thing. And he set up a path, and we're going to go through a lot of this. But fortunately for us, even though we're going to go through a lot of philosophy in the next couple of weeks, but as you know, the nature of the Rambam is to in a seemingly disorganized way, bounce back and forth from idea to idea. So there's going to be lots of stuff scattered around. So if you pay attention, every once in a while, he's going to throw something in there that'll blow us away and give us interesting facts. So I'm going to open the floor to questions, comments, etc., if anyone has them. You can unmute yourself if you have anything you want to say.
Excellent. Excellent going over that chapter. That was great.
Thank you. I'll admit it's not an easy one, this one. And the next few are not going to be easy either. But I'm going to have to resort to sometimes summarizing paragraphs rather than reading them, just because I don't think it would be painful, and it would take forever if I did it another way. Thank you. Any other comments? Any other questions? Observations? If there aren't, then I'll close up shop. And next week, it's going to get even deeper into philosophy, but it'll be fun. We'll learn. And go ahead.
I just wanted to say Asher Koach.
Thank you. And I promise there's going to be a lot of diversity. So hang in there. Stay the course. And about another month, maybe about a month and a half. What was that? Sorry.
I wish that my high school teachers who were trying to teach me didn't say some of those bogus things that you mentioned.
Yeah, they're very harmful. Those kinds of things are extremely harmful. I'll never forget. I'm not going to mention the names of the books but there were books that were given to me as a child to explain certain things to prove God, and I think they did more damage than they did good. Because when they turned out to be using science that was simply outdated and incorrect, so then you end up I mean, the damage is terrible. It's really terrible. Honesty is always the best approach. And even if you end up by saying, I'm confused, I'm looking, this is the truth, but it doesn't make sense, that's better than lying in order to make something make sense. Because if you do that, then you end up, you just ruin everything for everybody,
Yeah. For me, it was even halakha, like the rabbis tried to prove from Psalm 148, that men and women are supposed to be separate because it says Bachurim v'gam betulot zakenim narim. I wanted to show them how many times in the Torah and the Tanakh it says that men and women were together.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good Oh,
Yeah, definitely. Intellectual honesty. If we learn anything from Rambam at all, it's to be honest and to
Would-
actually search for real truth. You know, we may not find it, but at least we should die searching for it. You know, as opposed to going in the wrong direction. Yeah. All right. Well, I guess we'll close up, and thank you everyone for joining, and really
Thank you.
and let's we'll get together again next week. All right.
well.
All right. Bye-bye.